Welcome to the Cities at Tufts Colloquium. Along with our partners Shareable and the Kresge Foundation, I'm Julian Adjuman, and together with my research assistants Megan Tenhoff and Perry Scheinbaum, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative that recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. Today we are delighted to welcome Sheila Foster to be our Wednesday Colloquium speaker. Sheila is the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She holds a joint appointment with the Georgetown Law School and the McCourt School of Public Policy. She writes in the areas of environmental law and justice, urban land use law and policy, and state and local government. Her most recent work explores questions of urban law and governance through the lens of the commons, exemplified by her article, The City as Commons, in the Yale Law and Policy Review in 2016, and in her forthcoming book, MIT Press, The Co-City, which she's co-authored with Christian Iannone. She's one of the leading scholars on environmental justice and is the co-author of one of the field's seminal books, From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of Environmental Justice Movement, which is where in 2001 I first learned about Sheila's great work. She's a recognized authority on the role of cities and city leadership in promoting social and economic welfare, achieving environmental and climate justice, improving global governance, and addressing racial inequality. From 2017 to 2020, she served as the chair of the Advisory Committee for the Global Parliament of Mayors and is currently a member of New York City's Mayors Panel on Climate Change. She co-directs LabGov, an international applied research project that has pioneered an award-winning approach to economic development that enables local communities to become co-creators and stewards of urban revitalization in their neighborhoods. And her talk today, and I'm sure she's going to talk about the LabGov project, her talk today is called the Co-Cities Project. Sheila, a Zoom-tastic welcome to the Cities at Tufts Colloquium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. And I have long been a fan of your work. While I'm sharing my screen, I'll just say that your just sustainabilities work and your environmental justice work and sharing cities work has long shaped my work as well as the Co-Cities Project. So really happy to be here. So today, what I want to do is to talk about LabGov's Co-Cities projects, which has been many years in the making and is culminating in our forthcoming book for MIT Press, which is in the penultimate stage. And so the structure of my talk today will be as follows. First, I'm going to give a little bit of a background describing the provenance of the project, which began in Italy with my colleague, Christian Iannone, and then spread throughout Europe and other regions such as North America and South America, and is starting to take roots in Africa and other regions. Second, I'll give a brief overview of the empirical project in which we've surveyed over 190 cities and over 550 projects or policies to extract characteristics of what we call the co-city. And then third, I want to describe the conceptual underpinning of the project rooted in the idea of the urban commons and the city as a commons. And I'll give some examples of what we call constructed commons in this environment. And then lastly, I want to situate the co-city normatively, particularly as it relates to how it can serve as a powerful intervention into our current reckoning around racial justice. Okay, so where did it start? So the framework for the Co-City was put in place and in practice for the first time in 2012 to 2014, when my colleague Christian Iannone participated as a key investigator shaping the experimental grounds that Bologna would become and then drafting the Bologna regulation on the urban commons, which was adopted by the city in 2014. Right before he got involved in drafting in Bologna, the city had begun to put in place some policies that would reshape the socioeconomic system there, consistent with the idea of collaboration. And the city of Bologna began to draft this regulation to recognize and facilitate the right to collective action by residents and others to generate and care for shared urban resources. So the regulation was a cornerstone of this urban economic transformation and civic engagement culture, but it was only part of a larger experimentation. the regulation was designed to rely on neighborhood experimental projects as its starting point. These were fieldwork activities that consisted of 3 governance labs, a mentoring and co-design program where local officials work together with NGOs and residents with the support of experts and scholars to identify and co-design projects that would revitalize 3 types of what it called urban commons: cultural assets, green spaces, and city-owned buildings. And so there began the Co-Cities project with that regulation and then those experimental grounds. So those projects paved the way for the drafting of the regulation, which at its core had Pacts of Collaboration. That was the kind of central tool that was to establish public community or public-public partnerships entered into by the local administration, some mix of city inhabitants, civic groups, local NGOs and foundations, and private businesses. And these pacts, as the map shows, now the city has signed well over 300, I believe, were supposed to be created through a co-design process that contained a detailed description of the targeted project to co-manage or regenerate an urban resource and to define the project's scope. And the regulation also allowed for different forms of fiscal, logistical, training, and organizational support from the city to support these pacts. Now, we at LabGov have since evaluated these pacts, about 280 of them, the first 280, again, to extract some lessons from them. I won't go into that, but just so you know that that was the initial experimental ground, and in line with our approach to these kinds of experiments, we think it's important to look at the outcomes to see if they're consistent with the idea of the pacts. And in some cases they were, in many cases they were not. I can answer questions about that. Nevertheless, after Bologna put into place that process, several cities, both around Italy and then around Europe, but first Italy, began to develop co-city projects and experiment with these territorial collaboration pacts for commons-driven social and economic growth. So the city of Naples, for instance, recognized through a civic and collective use policy, informal management by city residents of city-owned buildings as urban commons. The city of Turin has a co-cities project right now funded by the EU that blends the Bologna and the Naples approach to reduce poverty in the city. Madrid passed an ordinance on social cooperation for the urban commons, and Barcelona is implementing a citizen asset program for community use and management. And other cities in Northern and Eastern Europe, like Ghent, Amsterdam, and others have worked on common and are working on a common regulatory scheme. So this led us to want to engage in the empirical part of the Co-Cities project, right? Based on the Bologna experience and the interests of other cities and communities to adopt this model or framework of collaboration or collective governance around urban commons, right, which are shared urban resources. We decided to survey. Now the map says 100, but now we're over 195 cities and over 550 policies. And this data set, which is contained in an open book and published on a web platform called commenting.city, provides various case studies of projects and public policies from the cities mapped. And what we were looking for, we identified in a group of case studies from every geographical region as a starting point to begin to identify emerging community or city level initiatives that are pushing urban areas toward new frontiers of collaborative urban governance, what we call social and economic pooling, and inclusive and fair city making. And the data set highlights common patterns and differences. And also we use those common patterns and differences to extract the relevant dimensions of what we now call the co-city, and created an index to then map those cities' experiments onto those design principles. And this brings me to what we have extracted from the empirical project, and it's what we call the Co-City Protocol, 1.0, which is to say that as it's experimented and applied in other places, we expect for it to be adapted and changed. And it certainly is in the projects that I have ongoing in the US, which I'll talk about. But the protocol on this slide is includes both what we call design principles, which is to say, what are the dimensions of these efforts that we've mapped, and also what we call a co-city cycle, right? Which is more of a process, starting with cheap talking, mapping, practicing, prototyping, testing prototypes, and then modeling, as in the regulation, right? So it begins on the ground and works with various stakeholders, puts them into practice, prototypes, tests, and models. And from what we've identified as the various dimensions, as you see, collective governance, what we call then enabling state, important that these not be privatized efforts, pooling economies, using the pooling of 5 actors and various resources, experimentalism and adaptability, as well as what we call tech justice, which is a recognition that that technology is important to a lot of these efforts. And we also have, as part of this protocol, what we call a toolkit, which is an identification of the various kinds of institutional and other mechanisms. So you see pacts, civic uses, land trusts, real estate development cooperatives, and kinds of finance, digital platforms, and other co-working spaces that, again, we've identified are important to a lot of the examples that we saw or have identified. So that's a general overview of the project and the empirical aspects. What I now want to turn on to is kind of what are the conceptual pillars of the Co-City project, which is as important, I think, as these empirical findings. And the conceptual pillar is ultimately what we call the urban commons and the city as a common. Starting about 10 years ago, both Christian and I, separately first and then together, have been exploring the idea in our scholarship that urban infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is later, and other available resources within cities like vacant land and available structures should be collectively or cooperatively governed, sharing governance responsibility with the local government and the state, depending on the scale of the resource. And we're very much walking in the footsteps of Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom's groundbreaking work in our study of the urban commons, where she identified this kind of collective action with regard to available shared resources. I'll come back to her. So I started first looking at community gardens, parks, and the neighborhood commons, and Christian urban roads and other urban infrastructure, and how they can be conceived as common resources. And then we later joined up to conceive of the city itself as a commons. Thinking of the city itself as a commons is a way to acknowledge that the city is generative, capable of providing for different social and economic needs of its populations. And again, just very much walking in Ostrom's footsteps. We think about these resources in terms of stewardship of resources, much like she did when she overturned decades of economic thought, which suggested that there were only 2 ways to manage and govern shared resources, either public or state control or private ownership. She found a middle ground, right, that users and communities were managing and stewarding a range of, in her case, natural resources using rich mixtures of public and private instrumentalities. And importantly, the rules that the communities and users set to manage these resources, right, were recognized by external governing bodies and public agencies. And often they were nested, she said, within larger government structures like a city, akin to what Bologna and other cities have done with the Pacts of Collaboration. They're effectively nesting these user-managed commons into a city structure. So this is what we refer to, well, what knowledge commons scholars who work in the area of intellectual property and data, what they call constructed commons, right? So the urban commons for us is constructed, unlike the natural commons. They emerge as a result of a process of bringing together communities and other stakeholders to co-design and co-produce shared common goods and services at different scales from existing urban infrastructure. And these constructed commons, our work has identified, the Co-City project, range from shared limited equity housing to wireless mesh and community broadband networks to shared energy microgrids and to other forms of essential social infrastructure. Some of these urban commons are longstanding enterprises dating back decades. I'll talk about that. Others are fairly new and experimental, right? But what they all have in common is that they're created from existing urban structure that are available to generate goods for human survival and flourishing, much like the fisheries, the forests, and the uncultivated lands that Ostrom found were being used collaboratively and collectively in her studies. So our starting point is available urban infrastructure. Consider that in New York City, a few years ago, the city comptroller released an audit of city-owned land, revealing that the city owns over 1,100 vacant properties spread throughout all 5 boroughs. Some of these properties have been vacant for 50 years or more. Also consider that there are, on top of that, an additional about 30,000 private parcels designated by the city tax code as vacant, abandoned, or foreclosed upon within the city boundaries. That's more than 7,300 acres of land. The fact that a global city like New York City has this amount of vacant land and structures still standing suggests the scale of the urban infrastructure that underlies this idea of the urban commons and the city as a common. Vacant land and structures are much more ubiquitous than people realize. And this is true whether we're talking about global cities like New York or struggling cities like Detroit, and every kind of city in between, Philadelphia, Oakland, Chicago. So Detroit Future City, the nonprofit planning and advocacy organization there, estimated that about 120,000 vacant lots exist in Detroit. And so, in addition to vacant lots, of course, vacant property includes abandoned factories, homes, strip malls, what I call in my work, property in transition. Most of this land was once privately owned, but at some point had fallen out of private hands, usually from some combination of abandonment, tax delinquency, white flight to the suburbs in the case of Detroit, and decades of disinvestment in urban neighborhoods, and has ended up in the domain of the local authority. And so in some sense, it's up for grabs, one might say, right? Returning back to the common, or the commons rather. And so the question increasingly being asked by scholars like Saskia Sassen is, who owns the city? Who owns this? To whom does the city belong? What we see in many cities, of course, is that neighboring residents and communities often begin to treat this property in transition, these resources, as open access or as a common pool resources that can serve the needs of underserved communities that lack green space, healthy food options, and housing. They're transformed into farms and gardens, or empty homes and buildings are renovated and reoccupied as housing. Some of you may know about the Moms for Housing that started in Oakland, but spread to Los Angeles and Philadelphia, where mothers with children in their care are leading a movement to occupy vacant homes to address the homelessness and housing instability at a time now, particularly when the COVID pandemic has made paying rent unmanageable for many. What you may not know is that these homes are owned by state agencies like the Philadelphia Housing Authority, the largest landlord in Pennsylvania, or Caltrans, the state transportation authority in California. These mothers are making claims to this property in public, or these public resources, as a commons, as part of their human right to be part of the city, the right to reclaim and reappropriate city resources, inhabit and share them, and actively participate in the formation and the use of those spaces. And communities desire more control of this land to use it in ways that allow them to rebuild their community and to meet their needs. Local governments, on the other hand, are often more interested in assembling this land and sometimes holding it in what's called a land bank, or actively trying to place it back into productive use by, selling it to developers, and communities are resisting that. So what are some types of constructed commons? Well, that protect, right, the use rights of communities as against the exchange rights or the commodification of this land. One which many of you know of are community land trusts, which are emerging in cities all over the world. Recall the Moms for Housing anecdote. They achieved a victory when the Oakland house they were occupying was transferred in a deal to the Oakland Community Land Trust, right? CLTs are nonprofit entities set up to work with local governments to purchase or transfer available land or lots or buildings for affordable housing, commercial buildings, green space. The land trust remains a steward by holding title to the land, but allows the users through long-term leases to occupy the land and also resale at a limited equity at a formula that's in the lease. And most importantly, the board of a land trust are collaboratively governed through what's called a tripartite structure. A third of users, a third of the general community who live in the area where the CLT operates, and a third usually of the public authority or funders, for instance. You probably know the most longstanding and famous land trust close to you in Tufts is the Dudley Street Land Trust, which came out of efforts of then residents of a poor Boston neighborhood who formed this to revitalize their neighborhood. And they work with the state and local government to assemble and convey to the land trust 15 acres of vacant lots owned by the city and 15 acres that were privately owned, the picture on the left, most of which had tax liens on them or were in foreclosure by the city. And the trust, with the help of public funds, private foundation grants, developed an urban village, what's depicted on the right, consisting of hundreds of affordable housing units, public green common spaces, community centers, an urban farm, refurbished schoolyards, and numerous playgrounds. So they control over 30 acres of land and are trying to expand, and also have sparked more land trusts around the region. What you may not know of is a different kind of land trust, right? So one question is often, can these scale up? Neighbor Space in Chicago is a really good example of scaling up, right? This trust preserves existing community gardens and open space throughout the city, particularly in areas where open space has been lacking or vanishing, which tends to occur in underserved areas. So Neighbor Space was created by 3 government agencies in 1996, the City of Chicago, the Park District, and the Forest Preserve District, that work with community leaders, residents, and NGOs to identify parts of the city that had the least amount of open land and where community groups were already active in stewarding the open space on these lots. So what began as a very small project, now in some of the most distressed neighborhoods in the city, now manages 115 plots throughout the city. And Neighbor Space operates as a higher level authority, where they transfer land and they clear title. And they take care of the technical aspects of the land, but they leave the governance to the community, right? To those that are a lead gardener with the community or overseer who are stewarding that land. And that's an example of what Elinor Ostrom would refer to as a nested system of governance. And here the gardens are nested in the land trust. But gardens and land are not the only kind of constructed commons that we're talking about. We also have found that constructed commons includes decentralized community wireless or broadband networks using, again, the infrastructure of the city. Mesh networks, you may know, have been established in many European and US cities, including the famed community mesh network in Red Hook, Brooklyn, designed to overcome the digital divide. The Detroit network, which provides connectivity to about 40% of its residents without internet access, and the mesh network in Berlin, designed to provide the service to newly arrived immigrants. Mesh networking relies on existing urban infrastructure by combining the efforts, pooling the efforts of many local actors, including public and private property owners who grant access to buildings and other structures to mount access points to create this solution to the last mile connectivity grant. In this model, No one owns the infrastructure. It's open and free access, but everyone who wants to access can contribute with their own resources to run it. It's an example of what my ex-colleague at Fordham, Olivier Sylvain, calls broadband localism, an approach that seeks to overcome broadband infrastructure by race, ethnicity, and income. And I'll say a bit about a project that I've been involved in Harlem, which is an attempt to create in a smart city, by the way, where 1 in 3 residents in certain neighborhoods do not have access to broadband, to create a community-governed broadband network to bridge this divide. And using a disaggregated edge cloud broadband network designed and tested through participatory protocols, which would put the cloud and edge cloud in public housing and other buildings around Harlem. Again, this is a digital constructed commons that can be replicated and scaled to other communities. And some of the principles underlying it are collective ownership. The network infrastructure is owned by the community where it's deployed. Collaborative management, the infrastructure is governed and operated by a community advisory board. Open design, the implementation details are public and accessible to everyone. Open participation, free peering agreements, and high security and privacy protocols. So this is what we call the Co-City project, the new urban commons, community land trust, limited equity forms of co-housing, community mesh, broadband networks are the kind of civic, neighborhood, and infrastructure goods that we have seen co-produced and co-created in cities all around the world, right? Usually through forms of pooling with at least 5 possible actors: social innovators, public authorities, private or commercial businesses, civil society organizations, knowledge institutions. And again, that usually reflect the principles of collective governance, enabling state, pooling experimentalism, and tech justice, which highlights access, participation, co-management, and co-ownership of technological and digital urban infrastructure. So what I want to lastly talk about, and again, at the bottom of this is what the Co-City cycle, right? What we have put in practice and also observed as elements of that practice, but again, adapted to context. The last part of my talk is I want to talk just kind of normatively a bit about how we see the Co-City, in particular as a response to the racial and reckoning that we're having right now in the US and in other parts of the world. We think it can be a powerful intervention, though not a panacea. And the reason we think so is that a lot of these forms of constructed commons, like community land trusts and limited equity mechanisms that enable low-income communities and communities of color to control and govern shared resources in their communities, is an important part of a larger unfinished racial and economic justice project in America. On the slide is an important book by Jessica Gordon Nembhard, whose research demonstrated that cooperative ownership mechanisms like trusts have their origins in the fight for Black civil rights and economic equality in America. So African Americans have a long and rich history of this cooperative ownership. Another important book, if you don't know about it, is Amanda Huron's Carving Out the Commons, which is a really deep exploration of the use of limited equity co-ops in Washington, DC, and largely Black communities as a response to the threat of gentrification. And she underscores the fact that for many residents, these cooperatives are a critical part of a larger civil rights struggle, right? Their goal, she writes, is to transform land that was treated as a commodity and from which they were in danger of being displaced into land that they can exercise some control over and keep accessible to their communities over the long run, even if they could not sell the land on the extractive market. We also see, for instance, cities like Seattle in the following slide, utilize land trusts to make bold investments in African American communities as a response to systemic racism. So there, the city of Seattle announced recently, I believe last year, would transfer $1 million in a withdrawn from service fire station to the local community land trust in a historically Black community, Africatown Community Land Trust, And the grant is designed to help them develop affordable rental housing and business opportunities in the district, as well as to establish a cultural innovation center. And for this reason, this is where I'll leave off, and it's with a project that I brought to the US, or started in the US, called Coast City Baton Rouge. I've endeavored in my work, in addition to Harlem, to apply the Coast City in communities that are structurally disadvantaged as a result of the historical legacy of racism. In 2019, Baton Rouge launched, partnering with us, the Coast City Baton Rouge project. Build Baton Rouge, which is the local redevelopment authority, a state agency, has as their mission to revitalize the historically African-American Plank Road corridor of Baton Rouge, what you see on the right, this 4-mile area, which used to be a African-American commercial corridor, but which is now quite distressed. Baton Rouge, so the urban metro region of Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana, has a population of about 800,000. The city parish of, or the city itself, has a population of about 450,000, and is very much a spatially segregated city by race and income, in what some describe as a tale of two cities, with higher quality housing and amenities and transportation in white higher income areas, and the lack of these amenities in Black areas like Plank Road. So as you see in the next slide, Plank Road, once a thriving commercial corridor, over the years has suffered from white flight and disinvestment, as many Black communities in the US, as well as from, frankly, deeply flawed urban renewal practices. It's bordered mostly by commercial land uses, with residential uses on the side streets and extending several blocks in either direction. Sidewalks, though present, are inconsistent and not continuous. The area has the city's highest concentration of zero-card households. The northern end of the corridor contains hundreds of blighted vacant lots and buildings, which Build Baton Rouge has in its, or has authority over through its land bank. But despite the blight, right, Plank Road is a significant anchor for the surrounding neighborhoods because it contains many assets, including not just available land and buildings that hold the opportunity for productive reuse, but also strong social and civic organizations. So in Baton Rouge, we're working with the redevelopment authority to reach a number of community goals listed here, including a desire for more social interaction, recreation, arts and youth-focused spaces, preserving the history of and authenticity of the neighborhoods, and lifting up Black-owned businesses and building and reinvesting wealth within the local economy, as well as affordable housing. And what we've done is, in addition to using land trust property to co-design a eco park, which you see here, various drawings working with the community and the students at LSU in their sustainability lab, as well as a combined land bank land trust hybrid. Land banks, they say, have a disposition problem. The city holds land but can't get rid of it. And land trusts have a acquisition problem. By combining them, which is the kind of new state of the art that's emerging in some places, then we can facilitate the kind of constructive commons that can provide the community with the kinds of things that they want to see. Okay, so I will stop there. The Coast City Baton Rouge has just been awarded a highly competitive $5 million Advancing Cities grant from JP Morgan Chase, which will support the efforts both to increase capacity of community members to engage in the co-design of these institutions, as well as to put money directly into the hands of the entrepreneurs in that community. And as decades of community economic development literature has shown, it's important that we identify and leverage existing community assets that enable these collective solutions by building on existing anchor institutions and relationships, which we're doing there. So our hope is that the Coast City approach can take root in other American cities, that are characterized by persistent racial stratification and that have been disinvested and forgotten, and that these new kind of collaborative ecosystems can create inclusive communities that can thrive. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sheila. That was a fantastic talk. What a rich set of studies. And, you know, I'm going to take moderator prerogative here. I mean, like myself, you work with theory, you work with practice, you work with communities. What are some of the key challenges you see in that?
Oh, wow, there are lots. Okay. You know, from the beginning, in starting with my environmental justice work, which I started in Camden, New Jersey, working with the community of South Camden. I think, first of all, it's important as academics to be humble when working with communities. I mean, I always say that that I don't go in, I'm invited in, right? In every instance, people reach out because they understand that what you're doing is important and can help them. One of the persistent challenges, I think, in working with, in particular, you know, disadvantaged communities, which is mostly where I worked, is, I think, capacity to some extent. And when I say capacity, not necessarily social capital, they have a lot of that. They have strong neighborhood institutions. They're very capable of understanding the issues, but rather time and money. And so I think that as someone who's trying to apply these theories all the way down and even reasoning from the ground up, it's important to take communities seriously and to involve them, but also to make sure that they have resources. Great. And to build their capacity.
Absolutely. We got a question from Ebony Gustav. Do you have any suggestions for occupying vacant city-owned property in New York City?
So that has happened. 596 Acres in New York City is a NGO that has long worked with occupied land and structures. The housing department of New York a couple years ago introduced or adopted a community land trust policy in which they would transfer money to communities to plan to occupy vacant buildings and land and put them in a community land trust. You know, there are occupied vacant, there have always been occupied buildings in New York in the East Village back in the 70s and 80s by artists in Soho. So it happens, right? But what we also know is that it's a precarious thing, right? Which is to say that the city, as a matter of property law, the city holds all the legal entitlements and they can eject you, even if it was privately owned property that was vacated, because again, as I've said, it falls into the public sphere when the private owner abandons or doesn't pay taxes. So it's really important from my perspective and from our perspective to create opportunities for these, you know, for this commons, right, for these common resources to be utilized by proximate communities to serve their needs. And that's really more what I'm focused on. And fortunately, New York City has been trying to enable that, another of our principles, the enabling state, right, to enable that happening in various communities. So there's the East Harlem Land Trust. There are a number of land trusts that are popping up in the city.
Our own student, Bailey Hu, is asking, she says, I know the name of the project is Co-Cities, but do you think any of these approaches would be well suited or could be adapted to rural areas?
Absolutely, and they have been actually. You know, if you look at the provenance of land trusts, it's in rural areas. I mean, usually to secure environmentally sensitive land from development. Of course, the way that land trusts have been put in place there have been problematic. They don't have the collective governance aspect that community land trusts do. But yes, there's nothing particularly urban about the mechanisms. I think what is urban about this work is that it happens in thick environments, right? Which is to say, you know, Elinor Ostrom studied the natural world where you have very homogeneous small communities. What happens when you try to import this concept to not only thick, dense cities, but also very diverse, heterogeneous cities where also the economic market is quite a force. And so a lot of the work that we've done is to talk in terms of the difficulty of doing that work in cities where most of the population is agglomerating. But absolutely, a lot of these approaches and mechanisms can be used in rural areas.
Yeah, I get asked the same question about the sharing cities concept. Could we think about the same? And I like the way you put it, that the process. Yeah, a very good point. Paula Hernandez asks, what are your thoughts about the 15-minute city approach?
It's I know that others have critiqued it from, in particular, from a kind of post-colonial critical race standpoint, and I think that's probably right. But I think it's hard to say. It doesn't. European cities are very different than most American cities, setting aside New York and other dense cities like Chicago. We're a very suburban nation, and even when we agglomerate in cities, I think that the idea of creating 15 minutes of amenities around every neighborhood is probably more of a stretch. It can be done, but I fear when we do that and how we do it. So I'm not against the idea, as I'm critical of how we implement it, as with most of these things, like what we now call environmental and climate gentrification, which is that we bring these wonderful ideas to communities that have long been distressed, and with the intention often of putting amenities and new public goods and private goods in those communities. But the ultimate impact is that, it sparks gentrification. So I would be concerned that is a risk. And so how do you implement the 15-minute city in a way that allows people to stay in place?
Yeah, great point. I was looking at the Paris 15-minute city proposals, and they're very much about the downtown area.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not about the banlieue where the immigrants and the people of color are living. So I think, like you, it's not the principles, it's the place and the way that some of these ideas are being implemented. We've got a sub-question from Paula. She says, how do you see the integration of food as a common as part of your concept and your project?
Yeah, actually, there's a food justice aspect to our Baton Rouge work, actually. Food, so, community gardens, urban farms, you look at places like Detroit, where, most of Detroit is not the area that's being redeveloped, is the neighborhoods. I was actually born in Detroit, most of my family's there, but was raised mostly in Miami. So Detroit is still very much a distress. Most of the city is distressed. But what Black farmers and others have done is to use that available land and structure to feed themselves, right, in food insecure communities. And the problem that they're having is, which speaks to this model, is that, again, the city is holding all this land in a land bank, and it's selling it off to a major corporation to rebuild farms. So I understand from press, but not to the Black farmers who have been stewarding and cultivating land for food justice or for food accessibility, have had a difficulty taking control of that land to build it out. So yes, I think that the kind of constructed commons uses urban infrastructure in a way that meets the needs, whether it's food or housing or broadband access of these communities, is at the heart of what I'm talking about. So food justice obviously is very much a part of it.
Thanks. Question from UEP student Josh McAlinden. Can you speak to the challenges of and approaches to engaging residents, particularly low-income residents who've limited free time, in the process of collective governance?
Yeah, I have gotten that question my entire career. and everyone has limited free time, in particular, but my experience, and I want to disabuse this notion. I disabuse it all the time. I've worked in South Camden, worked in Harlem, worked in Baton Rouge, worked in, grew up in part in the hood in Miami. I mean, they show up when they think that there will be a benefit from them. People will engage, right? When people will not engage if it's another public meeting where all they do is give feedback on something that seems to be a fait accompli, right? Or so yeah, people have limited time, but they spend time in their neighborhood and civic institutions. So very important in this work to always work with anchor institutions, right? So whether it's in Harlem in our broadband project, where we're working with Silicon Harlem, the anchor institution there, which can convene thousands of community members. We've gone to NYCHA housing, the public housing projects in New York, to meet with residents there, to rooms full of people. They have time when they think that they're going to get something out of it, that the time will pay dividends. And also, if you provide childcare, if you provide resources, like I say, to allow them to spend the time, right, and to dedicate some time to this. So it is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge everywhere. If you ask me to attend the local zoning meeting because someone wants to build something in my community, I mean, I'm really busy. I've got, kids at home, I've got a spouse, I've got, family members I'm taking care of. But if I think that I'm going to have an impact, I may take time. But if I don't, there's no way I'm going. So I don't think that calculation is super different for low-income communities. I think we misconceive of those communities' willingness, as they do through their own civic organizations, to, again, build their communities and create a better life for themselves.
Thanks. We've got a question from Ohud Kamal. He says, would such a method also apply to different political economies in contrast to the context you describe? Since I'm from Palestine, living in Jordan, I'm intrigued how we could make such professional experiences and their practical implications transferable to other contexts, such as the ones mentioned located in the Global South.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think, so 2 examples. One is of a group in the favelas of Rio that have been working on stabilizing the favela against gentrification using some of these concepts in a community land trust. And also in Puerto Rico, they put a favela, an informal community, in a land trust. So these mechanisms can translate, though very differently. And I would point you to the work of Teresa Williamson in Rio, who runs that project there. We've also worked in Accra, Ghana, on this. And the one thing I will say, so for instance, the state, the enabling state, is lesser of a factor there, because the view of many people that live and work there in communities like Jamestown, where we're talking to people about adopting this model, the state is not only non-existent for them, it's corrupt. And so they're much more reliant on other actors. So for instance, the entrepreneurs, the cultural institutions in their communities, even the energy companies and the entrepreneurs coming from all over the world to Accra. So there, the market actors as well as social innovators are more important maybe than the state, right? And also, I would say that, gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. So the design principle that seems to be most at work there is what we call pooling economies, right? And that's very much a kind of play on agglomeration economies. There's this idea that there is a way to spark, and then it takes off, an economy in which these various market, entrepreneurial, social innovators, residents, civic institutions pool together to construct these common goods. And so we certainly see at least the different dimensions of what we call the co-city playing out very differently in different contexts. So can it translate? Yes, but experimentalism is a principle. Adaptability is really important. One of the things that distressed us greatly after Bologna was what my colleague Christian calls the cutting and pasting of the Bologna regulation throughout, in particular, Italian cities. Just, without any attempt to adapt it to local context, and also to kind of reifying the legal part of this, which was not the point. It's not just to put a regulation in place. It's to work at the local level in communities to adapt it.
We have a question from Alejandro Manga. Does your study include, or can you say something about cooperative housing using the Commons framework?
Yes, so partly that's what Amanda Huron's book is about. I think this form of limited equity, again, enabled in both DC and New York. They have laws that enable residents to take over their buildings, to purchase them at a reasonable rate, and to create cooperative housing. In New York, it's a name with a leasing program. So if you're in public housing or in housing, low income or affordable housing, before a landlord can sell it, right, the residents can actually own it or co-own it. And in Washington, it's an act called TOPA that enables it. So in Europe, I think it takes a different kind of form. My colleague Christian has been working on many forms of co-housing there. So very much part of, again, the constructed commons. But what we're concerned about is how do you get there, right? How do you get there? And using, again, existing urban infrastructure. The reality is that urban land values are at historic highs in many of these places where people want to create cooperative housing. So there's a real challenge about how to create this housing out of existing infrastructure when the market has made it so costly. So yes, co-housing is a form of constructed commons. Amanda Huron's book goes into great depth on what that process was like in Washington, D.C.
We have a question from Rebecca Bratsby's. She says, I'm working with a community group organizing around waste transfer stations in South Queens. I think that the city as a commons framing can propel and amplify the EJ narrative. Have you thought about the intersection between the human right to breathe clean air and the city as commons?
Yeah, hi, Rebecca. I know Rebecca well, and I'm a fan of her work. I'm sure you do too, Julian. That's a great question. So the intersection certainly is, I think, the right to the city, which undergirds like the idea of the co-city and the city as a commons, this idea that people have a right to belong, a right to create sustainable communities, livable communities using the urban infrastructure. I mean, the EJ part of this, I think it has implications for EJ in the following way, right? A lot of the claim from environmental justice activists is this kind of right to equal protection, to equal air quality, to equal amenities. And so if the city is a common good, and by that, I mean, a platform that we all kind of share in parts of which are a real common resource, right? I've talked about available infrastructure. Then I think we should be able to use that to create cleaner, sustainable communities. And that can include, so for instance, in New York City, We Act, the Environmental Justice Group, has a whole climate plan, which includes, energy microgrids and a land trust, which has cooling centers. So again, the co-city approach can help to create those goods that improve the quality and the resiliency and the sustainability of environmental justice communities. Happy to talk offline, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. We got a question from the Colloquium Watch Party. This is a little party of people, Sheila, that meet together because they want to meet and watch together. And they're asking, can you describe the differentiation between the needs of youth and adult participants in co-city projects?
That's a really good one. The needs of youth. So, I mean, not to be too short in this answer, but certainly many of the adults we work with, I mean, are concerned about their children's lives in these communities and access to opportunity, including affordable and quality housing. And also, I will say, so if you think about our Baton Rouge project and the eco park that we're co-designing, I mean, a lot of that is to give space or green amenities in a community that lacks it. And also it's going to have an aspect that helps the flooding. So it's also responsive to some climate issues as well. But the communities that I'm focused on, back to Rebecca's question, right? There's often an overlap with the kinds of environmental justice issues that I have long written about. Which is not just about bad air and bad water, but it's also about a lack of green amenities that these communities don't have. And so if you're in a community like Plank Road, where do the kids go to play? You know, and what is the quality of the air? Right, as you know, the corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is cancerality, and there are a lot of petrochemical companies. So also the eco park, the trees, and planting green infrastructure is designed to improve not just the quality of living for adults, but probably most importantly for the kids, as well as the food justice aspect, and making sure that they have quality and affordable housing.
Okay, Sheila, last question, and I know we're running out of time, and this is just one that's really occurred to me. You and I both started off in kind of mainstream environmental justice in many ways, and yet I've moved into this idea of just sustainability, sharing cities, incomplete streets. You've moved into the co-cities framework and the commons. And I'm not sure where I'm going with the question, but how did we get to these places from environmental justice? And how do we see environmental justice now through the lens of two researchers working in allied but slightly different fields?
Right, that's a really good question. So partly what sparked me to make the term is a lot of frustration working on environmental justice because of the following, right? Why do certain communities suffer disproportionately from poor environmental quality, lead in their homes, lead in their pipes, contaminated soil, bad air, lack of green amenities? The answer to that does not lie in environmental regulation or environmental policy. Maybe some of it does. The answer goes to the root of how these communities were constructed and the kind of power that they have and the resources that they have. So I always thought to solve not just the environmental justice problem, but the housing justice problem and the food justice problem was to get to how we create, to your point, sustainable communities, right? And your work on just sustainabilities, I mean, along this path, your work was so important to me. So was spending time in Latin America, in Bogota, Panama City, Cuba, where, I'm like, oh my God, informal settlements, like this is like using open available land. Why don't we look at this through the lens of the commons? How do we use existing resources that these communities have or should have a right to have to create, and the state enabling them and other resources to create the kind of communities that EJ folks have been saying, not just as a reaction to keeping bad things out, but as proaction to creating good, healthy, sustainable communities. So that's how I got there.
Great. Well, Sheila, we could go on for ages, but thank you so much for this. Let's give Sheila a warm round of Zoom claps. And next Wednesday, we have Kurt Kolstedt, who's going to present on the past, present, and future of cities. Again, Sheila, thank you, and we'll speak soon.
Absolutely. It was such my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.